Frequently in your game, you end up in the in an endgame type of position of the endgame, which you have uneven material. For example, rook versus bishop, or bishop versus pawns, or queen versus pawn, or queen versus rook, and so on. There are all different types of positions that called uneven material. And those positions, some of them you have to know up front before you get there, whether they are even, they are winning, or they are drawn before you get there. And those positions are very, very important to know. There are many different kinds. They don't have basic rules. That's the problem with those positions. There is no basic rule that is saying that if you have an extra exchange, you're gonna win. There is no basic rule telling you that if you have an extra bishop, you have to win. No. Most likely you're going to win, but there are some positions that cannot be predictable, and you have to know them. That's the only way you can predict, not by looking at it and assessing it yourself. Let me give you a few examples. The most popular and very elementary, actually not most popular, but very elementary, when you have king and queen, and your opponent has king and pawn. This is material that every endgame you get, where a queen versus pawn must be determined whether it's a win or draw. There is no such a thing that one side has a chances to win a game. No, there is a definite win or draw situation. Well, here is the position. White has a pass pawn, and black is checking white. Now this is the rook pawn, and the verdict is it's a draw. It's a dead drawn position because you go away and you try to queen. There is nothing black can do to stop you from queening. For example, if they go queen d5, you go king b8, they go queen b4 check, king c7, queen c5, king b7, queen b5, king c7. And on queen a6, king b6, and on king b8, and on queen b6 check, king a8. You see, because of this stalemate position, black cannot make progress. Black has to release white's king, and then white comes out, and black has no chance to get their king closer. So, and if you don't get your king closer, you cannot checkmate white. That's why it is a draw. Now, only positions that are drawn when the stronger side has king away from this pawn are rook pawns, one we just saw, and the bishop pawns. Now there is another position that is drawn. Why? Now that's a different, only way you can draw those positions if you can use stalemate as an option. Check king a7, queen c5, king b5, queen b5. On king a7, queen c6, and on king b8, queen b6. Check, and here king a8 gives you a draw. And this is very important because if black takes white's pawn, that's a draw. So this is why pawn, the rook pawn and bishop pawn is always a draw if black's king is far away from this pawn. Now let's look at a couple of exceptions. Let's put again Well, this is the position. Now black's king is on e5, and white's pawn is on black's king is on d4, and white's pawn is on a7. Here black wins. Why black wins? Because black's king is not far enough from this pawn. Black's king is very close to white's pawn. Now let's see how it's going to look. You can go queen d5 check, king g1, queen d1 check, king g2, queen e2 check, king g1. And now the way you win this position, as I said, this is an exception. Now your king's play is decisive. Now you go king to c5, white queens, and now you go king to b6, and both sides have a queen, and white is about to get mated. White's gonna get mated, either queen d8 or queen c7 or queen e8. There's nothing white can do. They may have one desperate attempt to play queen to c6 check, but then white must take with the king, not with the queen, because it's a stalemate, with the king, and mate next move. So what we know here, pawn and bishop and rook and bishop pawns are drawn, with exception. Here is the exception. The exception if white, or the stronger side's king, is 2 moves away from the square, from the b6 square. If your king can get in 2 moves to the square on b6, which is close to the queening square, then you win. You put the queen with the checks on a second rank, and after king b8, you go king f4, king c5, and on a8 queen, you go king b6, and white wins. Now, all other pawns are lost. Now, with exception of one position, which we're gonna look in the end. For example, no matter how far stronger side's king is, now black is gonna win this position easily. Check. They're gonna go queen here, queen on b3, then check again, then queen b5 check, queen c5 check, and queen b6, queen c6 check. White must go in front of the pawn, and that's when black's king moves. White's playing king a7. Now series of checks. Again, queen a4, king b6, queen b4, king c7, queen c5. On king d7 again you go queen b6, and on king c8, queen c6 check, king b8, and you move the king again. You gain another tempo. So you're going to be doing the same thing several times, and every time you will be gaining time for your king to come closer. You will go with the same procedure over and over, and eventually you're going to get the position where you can simply go king c6, and on king c8, queen a6, and just take the pawn, or you can checkmate white several different ways. Here is another one, king b6, and on king. There are multiple ways, check and checkmate. So there are multiple ways to win once you know you can get your king closer to the queening pawn as many times, well, as close as you possibly can, because you know the pattern, how to put white's king in front of the pawn, which will give you an opportunity to get closer with the king. So that's one important position. The same goes, of course, for the central pawn, for the king pawn or the queen pawn. You do the same pattern exactly. Queen e5 check, king d1, king c7 in this case, queen c5 check, king d7, queen d5 check, king c7, queen e6, king d8, and queen d6. And after king e8, you move the king closer, and you do this same procedure several times until you get very close to your opponent's pawn, and then you easily create mating net. There is one exception I mentioned too, but this is so rare that even very strong players don't know about it. This is extremely rare example. Well, here is the case. White goes, well, here is the position. We have one pawn each. White goes d7, black goes d2. Black goes d2, white goes king e7, black goes king d3. Obviously black cannot queen because white queens and wins black's queen. So, but what is rare about this position that black can go king d3 and when white queens, black goes king to e2, and there is no check at all. So black is going to queen very next move. But this is a very rare position, and it's interesting to notice that if white king went to c7, then black's king would have gone to c2, and we still would have gotten position when white has no checks, and that's why position is drawn. If we put white king on b7, if white has only one check, just one check, then you can be sure that they eventually gonna get to the position where they're gonna have multiple tempos for the king to get closer. Give you a quick example. King b2, queen e5 check, king c2, queen c5 check, king b2, queen d4 check, and king c2, queen c4 check, queen d3 check, queen c3 check, and you get a tempo for a king. Then you're going to be gaining this tempo every several moves, and eventually you're going to end up very close to the winning pawn. So this is a winning position. So what we learn for king and queen versus king and pawn, that if the pawn is on the 7th rank and it's a rook pawn or bishop pawn, unless your opponent's king is very close to it, it's a draw. Any other pawn, queen side that has an extra queen is going to win. So that will be all you need to know with the king and queen versus king and pawn. Now let's look at some other odd positions. Well, for example, here is the position where you have an extra piece, and you have a bishop. White has an extra bishop, but white has absolutely no chance to win a game. It's very simple. It's a simple logic. What is black gonna do? They're gonna go back and forth with the king from c8 to d7. There is nothing white can do to make a progress here. Example. Well, for instance, white king gets to f6, king d7, king f7, king e6, on king c8, on king e6, king d8. There is nothing white can do. Black is going to be playing king c8, king d8. On bishop g5, they're going to go king d8, and on king d7, king a8. There's white has no way to make a progress. Dead draw. Again, now let's say because the color bishop is the dark square color, so it cannot get to pawns. Now, what is happening if bishop is a light square? Is this a win? The answer is no. Again, no. This is a draw as well. Well, in the pawn ending chapter, we learned that position where white has extra protected pass pawn, but it's on black's king is on 8th rank and white's protected pass pawn on 6th, it's drawn. It's a theoretically drawn position, and I covered it in the pawn ending lecture. Now, does white have any other way to make a progress? They can attempt, but it's not going to work. King e8, king e5, king e6, king d7, and now black's king is in a corner. Now, can they make a progress? The answer is no, and here is why. Bishop takes a6 is not going to do anything because black simply is going to take, and white king cannot get any closer because of the stalemate. Here is the attempt white can do. Bishop to e4, king to b8, king to d8, king to a8, and now white make this attempt. Bishop to c6. If black takes after king c7, it's all over. c5, b7 check, and b8 is checkmate. White queens and checkmates. However, bishop c6 does not do anything anyway, because black simply plays king to b8. And now, if white does not move the bishop, black is going to take the bishop, and we have the end game that we know very well is dead drawn. King just goes in the corner or to c8, it doesn't really matter, and it's a draw. b7, king b8. So there is no way to win. So interestingly enough, even if you have a light square bishop, the position is still drawn. Now, what happens if the knight if you have a knight? Is this the same thing? Is it a still draw? No. Knight, if you have a knight, knight wins. Why knight wins? Not because you're going to smother black king and give him checkmate. No, because this checkmate position is impossible to get. Legally impossible to get, because after king a8, if king goes to c8, it's going to be stalemate. If knight c7 check, then king b8. There is no way to make progress from here. The reason why this is winning, remember when we had the bishop on c6, when we played bishop c6, black has to play king b8 in order not to lose. But if you have the knight and you put the knight to c6, black must capture, since there is no other legal move. Black must capture, and then king c7, c5, b7, king a7, b8 queen is a checkmate. That's the difference between bishop and the knight. There is another very odd position when one side has an extra piece. Here, let me show you this position. Okay. In this position, here is the position. Black's king, white queens to b7 and b8. This position is draw. How is it that one side has an extra piece and it's a draw? It's a draw because white cannot make progress. Let's look at it again. All black does goes king b7, king a8. And they don't need to know anything else. White king comes to c5 and b5. Doesn't matter. Black goes king b7, and there is no way white can make a progress. If they go bishop b8, we take, king takes b8, and our king right where it's supposed to be. b7, king b8, it's a draw. It's interesting to notice that in this position, if white has a bishop, it's a draw, but if white has a pawn, then white wins. White wins because when you come close to b5 and black goes king a8, king a5, king b7, now you're going to give this piece that stands on a7, because if the piece is a bishop, then you have to give it on b8 and it's a draw. But if this piece is a pawn and you go a8, then black has to capture it, and now you go king a6, and black's king is in a wrong square and they lose the game. On king b8, b7, king c7, king a7, white wins and wins. So this is another odd position where an extra piece does not win. There are very few positions and you have to know them. One very common endgame where you have pawn and the bishop and you cannot win. It's right here. When you have a rook pawn and your opponent's king is in front of this pawn, and a queening square, which is a8 in this case, is the opposite from your bishop's color. You see, a8 square is white, and white's bishop is a dark square. So this is a draw. Black does not need to know what to do. They can go king a8 and b8, never leave the corner. It's an easy draw. There is no way they can lose. They go king a8 and king b8. That's all they do. There is no way white can make any progress. It's interesting how things may change if we add one more bishop for both sides. Now this is an interesting position. Now, is this a draw anyway? Because black's bishop is going to stand on this long diagonal forever. And if white wants to exchange the bishop, then we're going to get the position that we know that is drawn. On the other hand, you have to know also that pawn cannot win unless you drive the king out of the corner square. Does that mean we have a drawn position? No. This is a win for white. What white does, they put their king on b6, they put their bishop on e5, they are still mating black's king. Now, all black can do is just move with the bishop. Then white brings their pawn to a6. Not to a7, to a6. That's how white is going to win. And when black goes bishop e4, bishop f3, just waiting, then white goes bishop to e6, bishop to c8, and after bishop e4, bishop to b7. You see, it's a checkmate, because bishop takes, pawn takes, it's a checkmate. So what you do, you make the knight pawn out of the rook pawn, pawn switches the verticals. So that's how white wins. We already mentioned that if you have a rook pawn, which is a3 pawn in this case, and the bishop, the opposite of the queening square of this pawn, which is opposite to a8, the position is a draw. Now, if you had this position is a draw. With a pawn on a4, of course it's a draw also, because what the best white can do is to capture this pawn, which is going to lead to the original position that we said is drawn. If the pawn is on b5 instead, it's still a draw, because black will never go b4. But however, if black has both pawns on a4 and b5, this is a win for white. White wins now. And this is very interesting to notice how white is going to win this game. Here is how. White goes king d5. After king b7, they go king d6. And of course, white is not trying to go king c5 and win those pawns, because then it's going to be draw. White wins because black has another pawn on b5. Now black has to move. Black can go to b8, for example. White goes king to c6, and again white has no intention of capturing the b5 pawn. If black goes king to a8, then white goes king c7, and it's a forced mate, because now black has to push the pawn. White takes ab, a3 b5, a2 b6, a1 b7, checkmate. Now black made a bad move, which was king a8. But what happens if they go king c8? Then we go bishop f4, and on king d6 we make another waiting move, king e5, bishop e5. Now here is the problem black has. If they go king e8, on king c8 they're getting checkmated, because bishop c7, you still made your opponent's king, and after b4 you take, a takes b, and you're going to checkmate black the same way. So the way you can win this is, if black goes king e8, you drive the king farther away. You go bishop f6, and that's the idea. So you drive king the farther away, and then you win this position. Now let's look at this position. This is also a winning position, because only way white can win those positions if they force black to push the b pawn, and we can take en passant or take just a takes b. That's the only way to win this position. The way we do it, we go bishop b6, king d7, king e5. And you can come around after bishop c5 check, king d7. You are coming around the black's king. King c6, bishop b6. Now this is a win. On king d7, you go king f7. You want to penetrate to the b pawn, not because you want to take the b pawn. Now if black plays king c6, they lose quickly after king e7, king b5, king d7, king c4, king c7, and now white wins both of their pawns, and black king is not in the front of white's pawn. However, black goes king c8, but then you win easily by going king e7, and on king b8, king d7, and on king a8, you just simply pulling back bishop d4, and on king b8, you're pulling again bishop e3, and this is a win. Because now if black goes king a8, then after king c7, they get checkmated in 2 moves. They go b6 or b5, we take ab, and after a5, b7 is a checkmate. Well, if black tries, instead of king a8 going b5, we're going to take a takes b, and after king b7, we have to quickly come back with the king c5, king b5, we stop this pawn, and we win easily because we don't have any more rook pawn, we have the knight pawn, and knight pawn with an extra bishop wins almost always. So this is some tricky positions of when you have an extra bishop and extra bishop and a pawn with the opposite color, when your bishop is opposite color of queening square for your pawn, and it's normally a draw, and those are the couple of exceptions I just showed you. Knight versus bishop endgame I also consider as a mixed material endgames. Actually, it doesn't really matter where, in what chapter we're going to talk about it and in what chapter we're going to discuss it. We are going to cover now knight versus bishop endings. We know normally that bishop is always better when pawns are on opposite sides. So, and we already covered that chapter. We already covered that issue. Now I'm going to show you few exceptions on that. When one side has bishop and a pawn and the other side has knight and a pawn, it's most likely, very likely, and almost always a draw. Well, let me show you one example, actually very instructive example. Here is the position where white goes that way. So it looks like dead draw. Even if black did not have the f pawn, it's a dead draw. And it's true, but just because black has the f pawn, white wins. This is very interesting. White wins because their bishop on h7 is totally immobile. So if bishop can just get out of there, of the corner position, and go somewhere on a2, b3, c4, even if white loses black loses the f pawn, it will be a draw. However, this position is winning for white. This is an amazing part. White goes king h6, and obviously black has only one move, not to lose a bishop. Now white goes knight h4, and here goes black's first chance to bring the bishop out, which they cannot take because on bishop g8 there will be knight g6, checkmate. So black therefore has only one move, king g8. White goes knight f3, and now black must go back king to h8. Now white goes knight f5, and again black cannot play bishop g8 because of the checkmate on g6. Again black has to do king g8, and white goes knight to c6. Black goes king h8, again they want to play bishop g8. But after knight e7, you can tell that the game is over, because black does not have king move or the pawn moves, so bishop must move. If bishop goes to g6, knight will take the bishop, and if bishop goes to g8, then knight to g6, checkmate. In both cases, white wins. So, but this is an exception. We don't normally win with king, pawn, and a minor piece versus king, pawn, and a minor piece. Now, it's an interesting story with the rook versus bishop. Now, what is the result of king and rook versus king and bishop? Without pawns, it's a most likely draw. Over 90% of the positions are draw, even if the king is in the corner. Now, let's look at this position. King is in the corner, and if white has the bishop, if black has the bishop, the color opposite to the corner where king is, black draws very easily. On rook a7, black simply goes bishop g8 and goes bishop out and bishop back into g8, because white can never play rook a8 because of the stalemate. The different situation if the bishop is of a different color. Now, bishop is the same color as the corner square. Now, this is the position which white wins. How should white win? White goes rook f4, and you see now, if black goes bishop f6, then rook c4 wins with a double attack, attacking bishop, and the checkmate on c8. Now, if bishop g7, rook c8 check, and bishop f8, rook just makes any move on the back rank, and white checkmates next move. After king h8, rook takes f8. So after rook f4, black must try to not to allow white to attack bishop and the back rank. For example, on bishop b2, we're going to go rook b4, and even if black plays bishop e5, then rook e4, and you see the rook e8 is next move. So black should try to play bishop to g1. Now on bishop to g1, again, only way white can win if they attack simultaneously the back rank and the bishop. That can be done with rook f1, and now you see that anywhere black goes on this diagonal, bishop e3 or bishop d4, c5, b8, or a7, white will respectively play on any of these files and easily win the game. How if black goes to h2, then white goes to h1 with the rook. And now again, wherever black goes, white will put the rook on that file, and on bishop g3, we go rook to h3. And you see, black cannot play bishop e5 or d6 or c7 or b8, because we will play rook e5 on bishop e5, and on bishop d6, rook d5. So, but if black plays bishop f4, that's different, but now we win because of the other reason. Now rook c3, threatening mate. When king moves to f8, then we go rook f3. You see, bishop is on the f file, and white wins easily. So this is rook versus bishop positions. So again, if blacks, or the side that has a king, side that has a bishop, if their king is not cornered, then we have even nothing to discuss about. It's an easy draw. If it's in a corner, it all depends whether the bishop they have is the same color as the corner where the king is. That's bad news for the side that has a bishop. And if it's the opposite color bishop, the color of the bishop is the opposite then the corner, then it's an easy draw. That's all you have to know before you get to that ending. You have to remember, rook versus bishop, always a draw. If it's an exception, if my king is in a corner, or I have to know, I have to have a bishop opposite of the color of the corner where the king is. Now, here is one interesting position that was for many, many years was unclear whether it was winning or not. It's a king, rook, and bishop versus king and rook. Well, this position is a draw. However, on the highest level, even there were games where side with a king and bishop would have won. Even the player like David Bronstein, who was one of the top players in the world, even he lost. Of course, it was many years ago, before theory was developed, how to draw that position. Even he lost to Vasily Smyslov, the end game with rook and bishop versus rook. This ending is a drawn. There is a way, there are two ways to draw. The one way, the way book recommends, which you can easily look in the book and pick up the rule from there, or the other way, which I found it, and it's also very interesting. What you do, you put your king on d7 or e7, whatever square it is, which has to be the opposite color of the square of your opponent's bishop, which is going to be d7 or e2 here, and put the rook on g2. This position of king on d7 and rook on b7, which you can get unless you're already cornered and you're already getting checkmated. Of course, we can't help you in that case. But this is the position from where, if we give this position to white, white will never make a progress here. If it's our move, black's move, we're going to go rook c7 or king c7, whichever, and then rook b7. That's all you need to know. There is no way white can make a progress here. There is an attempt to make a progress, but there is no progress can be made. For instance, if check, king goes to c8, check back, king d7, and if black goes bishop, white goes bishop d6, we give check and go back. There is one attempt, one white may try. Rook h6, rook c7, they may go rook g6, waiting move, and after rook b7, bishop to b6. Now you see black cannot move the rook, because then they are going to lose. For example, on rook b8, there is a check, king c8, king c6, and the game is over. But black has always only one square to go to, and that one square will always be there, and there is no way white can make progress. The move is king c8. There is no way white is making progress. If they give check, we're going to come up. So if otherwise, we're going to go king d7 again, whatever they do, and on obvious move king c6, that looks like a winning move, we have rook c7 check, and this move always will be there. This obviously white cannot capture the rook because it's a stalemate, and that this one, like a last resource rescue, is always going to be there. That's all you have to know. Otherwise, when you stay like this and go back rook and forth, that's an easy draw. I would say this may be an even easier draw than draw that was given in the books, that all the books on endgames, they tell you how to draw this. Encyclopedia of Endgames, they give you the other ways to drawing, which is also reliable, but this may be easier to adapt. Well, it's up to you, your choice. You will do fine either way. So now let's go to the other positions, the other uneven material positions. Well, let me give you one example. When one side has king and a queen only, no pawns, and the other side has king, knight, and bishop. Well, ordinarily it has to be easy win, and not in this case. In this case, it's an easy draw. So what is the case? This is the case. This is the case where neither side can make any progress, and here is why. White goes king h2, king h1, king f1. King goes in this area, walks in the area of the corner, and black can put their queen anywhere they wish, but black cannot get close with the king. And as you know, you cannot checkmate me with just a queen without help of a king. King can come as close as this, f4, but that's not close enough to checkmate white's king. If black goes queen e1, we always gonna have one square that is enough to defend position. Bishop h1, and our next move is going to be bishop g2. There is nothing black can do. They can go queen h4, king g1, queen e3, bishop g2. There is no way of getting queen any closer. This is the fortress position, and fortress positions are very frequently used as a defensive source, defensive resource. So this position is a draw. Well, there is another position. For example, well, let me show you example of a fortress. Very interesting example of a fortress. Well, here it is. One side has an extra rook. Hold the rook. We have this position. There is a position. With a fortress. White goes king g1 and king g2. Black has an extra rook. Can black win this position? No, because they can never, in order to win this position with black, you have to penetrate with the king or with the rook. Either one of them will do fine, except they cannot do it. Rook h3, king g2, rook back, king g1. And rook f8, king g2 again. We go king g2 and king g1. And if it's in this position white's move, white will go king f2. White will never move pawns. f2 and g2, f2 and g2. There is no way of making progress. So this is a draw. Very interesting endgames are the endings where one side has a rook and the other side has pawn. One pawn, or two pawns, or connected pawns, or multiple pawns. Let's get, for example, well, we know that two connected pawns, two connected pass pawns always represent some power. And if they are way too far advanced, they may be extremely dangerous. So here is the case we have when black's pawns queening here towards me, f1 or g2, g1, and white has to make a draw. This is actually a fascinating position, and this is a drawn position. And here is what happens, how white draws. Now, obviously, white cannot try to stop black's pawns because black is going to go g2, and now the game is over. Next move, one of the pawns is going to queen. So what white does instead, they go king f6, creating checkmating threat. And obviously, if black goes to g8, that's not going to do any good because king g8. Now king f8, king f6. So black has to try to win by going the other side, the other way. King e6, king d8, king d6. After king c8, now white cannot play king c6 because there is no checkmate threat. So what white does, goes rook c1 check, king b7, and white goes rook b1 check again. If black goes king a7, now white goes king c7. Now we are threatening checkmate again, vertical this time. Black comes up, king a6, king c6, king a5, king c5, king a4, king c4, king a3, and king c3. And this is very interesting. Black now must go back and make a draw. If black attempts to win by playing king a2, because there is no, after king c2, there is no mating threat, then after king a2, black immediately loses the game because white goes rook to f1, and now black can just resign right away. Here is why. Rook f1, black has only two legal moves. One of them, king a3, rook a1 checkmate, hardly acceptable. And the second is g2, rook takes f2 with a check, and picking up the second pawn. So that's how you can lose. By the way, talking about this position, I have to tell you why, for example, rook f1 or king g4 is not a good move with a rook on f1. Why this position, king, if one side has king and queen, the other has king and rook, these positions are lost. This is a lost position. White loses. King and queen always win, almost always win against king and the rook. So now let's go on with the positions, and then we're going to cover how king and queen can win against king and rook. There is another position with two connected pass pawns. This is another fascinating position, actually. Well, here is this. This is the position with white to move, and white needs to draw this position. Well, if white can just stop these pawns, then they are not going to draw, then they're going to win. So, but how is it a draw? If we don't stop them, if we don't stop these pawns, those pawns going to queen, and if we stop them, we're going to win. However, the result is a draw. Here is why. If white's rook was on a1 or b1, then white wins easily. Goes king g3, d3, king f2, and white has no problems. Then they're just going to come around and win both of black's pawns. Well, white's rook is not there. White's rook is on c1. And now when we go king g3, black goes d3, and now the threat, and on king f2, the move is d2, and that was the threat. And white here has to find a way to draw. Rook e1 doesn't work because black is simply going to make a queen. They are not going to take the rook. The drawing move is to stop black from taking rook and queening on c-file. So the move is rook to c8 check. That's the only way you can draw in this position. And now when black takes white's king, white gets both of black's pawns. White takes on e2, and next move they take the other pawn. This is an interesting position. Now, what if our king is far away, and where do we have to be if both kings are far away to stop those pawns? Remember, if one pawn goes to a3, and you can play rook a1, for example, those pawns are not going to move anymore. Now white can simply come closer with the king and get both of those pawns. Very interesting move. Rook a1, not rook h3 because we go a2. We have to keep as a target, attack the pawn that is advanced further, and at the same time stop him from advancing further. So this is the move to win. Of course, if kings were the opposite, so if black's king was closer than white's king, then black may win. So it all depends on the position of the queen. The pattern how to stop the pawns is the rook a1 move. Now let's see a very interesting position where the two strong players played, and it's interesting, even strong players sometimes can make critical mistake. And here is the mistake. In this position, player that played with a black made f3 move, and the player with a white resigned. What was the mistake? Mistake was the resignation. The reason why white resigned, because if white plays rook takes e3, black goes f2, and the next move is f1 queen. Now if black queens f1, they're gonna win. There is no way white can stop this pawn. On rook e4 check, we're gonna go king g5, rook e5, king g6, rook e6, king f7. Nothing can stop black from queening. However, in this position, f3 move leads to immediate draw. White could have drawn here in one move by playing rook to e4 check. Now, no matter where black king goes, white is going to take the e3 pawn next move, and you will see that that will lead to an easy draw. For example, if king g3, rook takes a3, and next move you can take this pawn since it's pinned. But if black goes king f5, then you take rook e3, and pawn cannot move anymore because you have rook f3. So black has to go king f4, and then it's going to be a draw anyway. So very important, on f3, rook to e4 check leads to a draw. Those are like some basic positions. Of course, any other position, we can give you a lot of different positions where how rook fights against one pawn or connected two pawns, and it always depends on the position of the king. And the rule is that you have to calculate, with the exception of few positions, you have to calculate one little position of the king and the rule changes. So it all depends on a calculation. So those are some interesting positions that I gave you now, and they indicate how many unexpected patterns we can see in seemingly simple position. We already discussed some positions with while one side has just a bare king and the other side has bishop and a pawn. And we said if you have a rook pawn only, if you have a knight or bishop pawn, you always win. If you have a rook pawn, you can win only if the color of the corner where you're queening and color of your bishop are the same. So this is light square bishop and a8 square is light, so you win. If it's dark square, it's a draw. We discussed that. That's the only rule that goes with bishop and a pawn versus king. When knight and pawn versus king, there are only two positions that are drawn. Here is position 1. Okay, suppose black plays king b6 attacking white's pawn. White has only one move that wins in this position, and that move is king to b4, the knight to b4. Then white brings the king closer and comes closer, and eventually they will win the game. a7, and now king a8 mate, king c8 we queen, and we win. Now, why this is the only way to win in this position? Obviously knight b8 is not good, because king a7 and white loses knight or the pawn. And the a7 move is also no good, because after king b7, this is a draw, because black is going to play king a8 and king b7, and there is no way white can make any kind of progress. They can come closer with the king to b5, and then what? They will never be able to release the knight, because knight always has to support the a7 pawn. If king supports the a7 pawn, then it's a stalemate. So it's a draw either way. In only one other position where king, knight, and pawn does not win against bare king is this. Now, pawn is queening, and black has to play king c8 or king c7 not to let white's king out. Which way do we go, king c7 or king c8? Now, no matter where knight stands, there will be always one move that draws. Now, one of these moves draws, the other loses. Always put, this is like a strange opposition of king versus knight. Always put your king on the color where the knight is, on the color of the square that knight stands on. Now it's a draw, because when white plays knight c6, king c8, knight d4, king c7, knight c4, king c8, knight b6, king c7. And black's next move is going to be king c8 always, because knight has to move the b6 square. So the main rule, the rule is that you should always have secured c8 and c7 squares. And the rule says if black will be going from dark square to a white, black needs to go to dark square, from dark square to a white square. So is the knight. Knight from light square can only move to dark square, and from dark square can only move to light square. Therefore, we cannot, let's see what white will never deprive black one of these two squares. Let's suppose we make a wrong move, king c8. Now we're gonna lose, because after knight c6, king c7, knight e5, king c8, and now knight b5. You see, white's next move is going to be king out, because black's king cannot go to c7. That's the rule. That's the kind of an opposition. That's where you can go wrong. So this is a draw. Now another position I said that we're going to discuss is king and the queen versus king and rook. Now this is always winning position. There are some exceptions. First, let me show you how you win. The way you win is you have to drive your opponent's king to the corner. Well, there it is. You succeeded it. Suppose you succeeded it and you drove him to the corner. And now the black's rook has always been near the black king. Now in this position, black loses, because whatever move they make, they will lose. If it's black's move, now black loses the rook, and if it's white's move now, white can make it black's move. Well, here's what I mean. So if it's white's move, you get to this position, you go queen d8 check, king a7, queen d4 check, king b8 or king a8, doesn't matter, queen h8 check, king a7, queen a1 check, king b8, and queen a5. So we reach the same position. It's a black's move now, and now black loses because black has to separate king and the rook. Rook has to step away from the king, and then white is gonna win the rook. The reason on rook a7 we have queen d8 checkmate. So rook and king a6 we can go queen a6 and win the rook. So rook has to go away somewhere. Now let's check all the rook moves on the horizontal, on the 7th horizontal, and then we check all the moves on the B vertical. Now on the 7th horizontal, first move is rook e7, queen just give check and pick up the rook. Very simple. Now rook f7, basically here what we do, we use one rule. You can go, actually several ways you can win. You can go queen d8 check, queen d4 check, king goes back, queen h8 check, king goes a7, now queen a1 check, king b8, queen b2 check. You see, the king can never go to c8 because queen to h8 is a checkmate. And now a king a7 or king a8, queen a2 check. Eventually, you're going to hit the king and the rook at the same time, and interposing is not going to help because of the checkmate. That's why queen is so powerful piece. It can go vertical, horizontal, diagonal. Any straight line it can go to. And that's why it's so powerful. Now, same pattern applies if rook goes to f7. What you do, queen d8, exact same thing we're going to do. We just, no, if rook goes to g7, we're going to do exact same thing. Actually here, we can do even this way. Queen b4 check. We know he cannot go king c8 because queen f8. He goes king a7. Now we go queen a3 check, king b8, and queen b2 check. You see, eventually we are going to attack king and the rook, and we're going to win. So if he goes to h7, it's the same thing. We're going to be checking, and eventually we're going to check him on b1 and pick up the rook. It's very simple. Same thing happens if rook moves vertically. Then we go queen e5 check, king a7, queen e7, queen g7 check. Better off here. Now king cannot come to a6. because queen a1 checkmate, and after king b8, queen g8 check, and pick up the rook. Or king a8 also queen g8 check, and rook b8, queen a2 checkmate. So these are the basic principles. So you know all you need to do is to separate your opponent's king and the rook, and then queen is powerful enough piece to catch the rook with the check. Now let me show you one interesting position which is total exception from the main. Let me show you a position where king and rook will draw versus king and queen. Here is the position. Black gives check. This position is a draw. White can never win this. Now why? Because there will be perpetual check, and here is why. King b2, rook b7 check, king a3, rook a7 check, king b4, rook b7 check. Now notice that white's king can never cross the c file, because there will be rook c7 winning the queen. So rook b7 check, and on king a6, rook a7 check, and when white goes king b6, there will be rook a6 check. This is the key resource that black has. Now white has to take the rook, and then we have a stalemate. It's a draw, and that's the only exception I would know where king and rook can draw versus king and queen. So that's all I want to say about the position with king and queen versus king and the rook. We know that rook versus bishop without pawns, it's over 90% of the cases are drawn. How about rook and a pawn versus minor piece? For example, versus bishop. That should be winning unless there is unusual case. It wins every time if this case is not there. So we are talking about unusual case like this. Black has king on h8, white has king somewhere on g5, pawn on h6, bishop, light square bishop, and rook on a7. Now this is an easy draw for black, because there is nothing white can do to drive black's king out of the corner, and pawn is not a much help. If white goes pawn h7, black will take it, and on king h6 black simply plays bishop g8, and we already mentioned that if the bishop is the opposite color of the corner where the king is, this position cannot be won. This is an easy draw. So that's as much as you need to know with about rook and pawn versus bishop. Now there are some positions where we have an exchange. Well, that means a rook for a minor piece. Then they are not that easy to win. For example, here is the one, the simple position where white has an extra piece, extra exchange, which is rook versus bishop. This position is winning. You have to know few things about this position in order to win. Okay, you go king d4, you have to drive black's king back. This is the stage one and necessary stage. It will come down to the point where we're going to have to give up a rook for pawn and the bishop. But once you do that, make sure the rook and pawn, the king and pawn versus king position you're going to get is one of the winning ones. And in the first chapter, king and pawn endings, That's what we did. And every position we have, when king and pawn versus king, we know it's a definite win or definite draw. So here's what you do here. Rook to c5, king f6, maybe you're going to go rook b5, king e6, rook b6, king e7. So, okay, we have a way to drive king back. Now we go king e5. Then we can go rook a6 check and rook a7 check. We can drive king even further down. And we can go king f6. Now he goes king e8. Now we have to sacrifice on f5, but the way that position is winning. For instance, we're going to go rook a5. Now watch carefully. If black goes king d7, you can take on f5, because after bishop takes f5, king takes f5. In order for black to draw, they have to go king f7, and they cannot do it from d7. So that's why in this position, black cannot go king f8 because, well, there is no rook a8, but we can go rook b5, and after king e5, we can go king e6. And now, if black goes king f8, how can we win this position? Okay, you want to make sure when you take on f5, black cannot, when you take on f5, and you win this pawn, black cannot play king f7. That's the only thing you need to know. And there are ways of doing it. For instance, you could have done from rook a8 check and rook g8, rook f7, king g8, rook f7, bishop c2. So now how are we going to do it? We may be able to squeeze king even further and king g6. Now you see, king cannot move because of the checkmate, and if bishop moves, actually they're going to lose the bishop. What if bishop goes to g2? Can we take the f-pawn? No, we cannot take the f-pawn. We cannot take it with the king because we're going to lose the rook. We cannot take it with the rook because he goes bishop e4, pinning our rook. Next move, black is going to take the rook on f5 and play king f7, which will lead to opposition. But after bishop to g2, white can win easily by playing simple rook c7, threatening checkmate, and pick up the pawn next move. So what are the black's options? If black goes bishop d3, we're going to attack bishop and the checkmate. So, and same thing is going to happen on bishop c2, and same thing is going to happen on bishop b1 with rook b7. So that means that black cannot go on a back rank when we give check. So black has to step aside to king g6. But then we win by playing king e6, or maybe later rook. Well, you have to put the rook on f5, rook c7, rook c8, rook f8, and you give king e7 and try to drive black's king further away. King h6, now you go king f6, king h5, and now you can tell if you simply go rook g5 and play rook takes f5, you reached the position where you win this pawn, and the king and pawn endgame where black cannot play king f7, you win. So that's how you win this position. But there are a lot more difficult positions than this. A lot more difficult positions is, for example, here we have 3 pawns each. And we have more active king. We have rook versus bishop. And also we have great difficulties winning this endgame. How can we make progress? Black just plays bishop c3, bishop b2, and plays with the bishop on this diagonal. How can white make progress? Only white can make progress to play rook d7. Actually, d7 is a good square for rook. And then go g4. Unless white has this breakthrough, they will never win this game. That's what the winning move is. Now, after g4, black can capture the g-pawn two different ways. If they take with the f-pawn, white goes f5, black has to take, white takes on f5, and you see why you want your rook to be on d-file. Make sure black cannot just go and queen. The bishop cannot be on d4. Now if black plays g3, they're going to immediately lose the g-pawn, and then they're going to lose the h-pawn and lose the game. Well, actually that's going to happen whether they play g3 or not. White is simply going to go king g5 or king g6 and pick up the h-pawn, and later on g-pawn, and white is winning easily. White is winning easily because of the dark square bishop. Dark square bishop, and you see the color of the corner is dark. It has to be light square bishop in order for black to draw. So that's what's going to happen if white takes, if black takes with the f-pawn. But if they take with h-pawn, it's almost the same thing. We go h3, black is going to take, king takes f5, and now if they go g3, so we have to stop both of those pawns. We could go rook d2. This is going to stop both of those pawns. And now we're going to go king g5, or on h4 we're going to go king g4, and we're going to win the game. So these positions are winning. All we have to do before we get to the breakthrough is find the best position for our rook. Good positions are d7 and c7, and e7 may not be bad positions. Those are the winning positions for the rook. So in g4 is the plan, breakthrough, and then white king penetrates on a queen side, and they win the game. So that's the only way you're going to win this type of position. So that's all about rook and pawns versus bishop and pawns. Now, the evaluation of chess pieces in the game varies depending on positions, of course. Well, sometimes we know that we say that rook is equals to 5 units or 5 pawns and so on, and bishop is to 3 pawns. But it varies from one position to another. So, and it's not always has to be the concrete position. For example, if we have position where 2 minor pieces versus rook in the middle game, it's decisive advantage for 2 minor pieces. If we have the position a rook and a pawn versus 2 minor pieces in the middle game, it's a big advantage for rook and for the 2 minor pieces. Even a rook and 2 pawns for 2 minor pieces is not sufficient compensation, because 2 minor pieces are extremely powerful in the middle game. Completely different story we see in the end game. A rook, especially if there is pass pawn present, so rook is a very powerful piece. Here we just have a position in front of us where we have a rook and a pawn versus 2 minor pieces. White has solid advantage. I'm not going to tell you whether white is winning or not. I don't know myself. White has good winning chances. So it varies from position to position. Rook is very strong piece in the end game because it supports movement of the pass pawn and can be very active. And two minor pieces, they normally you use two minor pieces in creating attack on opponent's king. Well, here in this position, the evaluation of this position is going to change drastically if we can put queens on the board. If we put the queens on the board, it's clearly big advantage for black. If we take queens on the board, off the board, it's advantage for white, obviously. Now, let's discuss some odd positions in the end game. Some tactics in the end games. Tactics, well, some people think once we get the end game, it's a very quiet and boring part of the game. No. End game may be very tactical, maybe a lot of tactical shots. Here is something very interesting. I'm going to show you now. Here is the position. Here is the position. In this position, it's white's move. White moves this way, and black moves the other way. Now, why we didn't discuss this in the rook ending positions, you're going to understand, because in two moves, we are not going to have rook ending. We're going to have completely odd material ending. White goes f7, black goes b4, white goes f8, and black goes b3. White has an extra queen for 2 pawns only, and they are on the move. Winning this position is not easy at all. Black has a threat of b2 check, and on queen a3 check, there is a rook a2. It's very difficult to win. However, there is a win, and a win is based strictly on tactical shots. Queen a3 check is the first move. Rook goes to a2, and now rook to f2. This is a shocking surprise for black, and only move black has is the b2 check, because if black plays rook takes a3, then after rook to b2, they have only one legal move, rook a2, and rook b1 is a checkmate. So the only move black has here is b2 check. And now we get very instructive position. White plays queen takes b2, rook takes b2, rook takes b2, a3. And here is only one winning move for white. If white goes either vertically or horizontally after black plays a2, it's an easy draw. So white has to play rook b1 check, king a2, and now rook back to b8, and black must go king a1, and now king c2. When black goes a2, king b3, this is the only way white can win. And after king b1, rook to a1, you see the mating trick is rook h1. Black has to make knight, and after king c3, this is theoretically known position, easily won for white, because white wins black's knight in next couple of moves. For example, king c1 is not possible, knight c2, rook loses to the same, rook h1 check, but after king a2 you can give rook h2 check, on king a3 rook b2, and black can resign. Now this is tactical position. Another extremely unusual position. We know that rook versus bishop, well, king and rook versus king and bishop, without pawns on board, it's a draw. We know this, and there is no question, but it's hard to imagine that we can have two rooks versus one bishop, and it's still going to be a draw. There is one type of position only, and here it is. Here is the position when a rook is pinned, and white is going to play bishop b6, bishop a7 all day long, and there is no way black can get out of this pin without losing rook for nothing. If rook moves anywhere on the side to a1 or h1, white simply plays bishop takes rook, and if queen crosses, tries to get out of the pin, white is going to take rook. So therefore this is a draw. Very unusual, and again it's more like a tactical, you can call it tactical position or unusual position. It's a very, very unusual position. So this is a draw. So another, I want to show you some extremely tactical position based on Zugzwang. Well, you cannot see too many of those positions, even in the middle game, too many the combinations like this, even in the middle game. But however, we have it here. Here is the position. This is, I think, is a part of the study that was created by one of the great chess composers. So the move is queen c4 check. Black is coming this way. So queen b4. And let me show you how white is winning here. Well, you can tell if white goes queen c6 check, queen b5, there is going to be no progress can be made. So the way white wins in this position is going knight b6 check. And when black takes, white simply plays very unusual move, queen to d3. And now in this position, what can black do? White has no threats. There are 4 pawns down, and they are winning. Now let's see what can black do. Black cannot move the queen, because anywhere queen goes, black gets checkmated. If black queen goes